which is don't get furious, get curious. And that is the puzzle mindset. So whether it's, literal puzzles or little personal puzzles about your marriage or work, or the big societal puzzles, that mindset, I think, of deep curiosity and willingness to change and creativity, ingenuity, all these are part of the puzzler mindset.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you.
What if you had no problems? What if you had instead puzzles? Well, my guest today, AJ Jacobs, is a man who's in the puzzle business. He can help you solve puzzles. He can help you live a more meaningful, happier, healthier life by cultivating something he calls the puzzle mindset. He talks about it in this interview and in his most recent book, The Puzzler, one man's quest to solve the most baffling puzzles ever, from crosswords to jigsaws to the meaning of life. AJ, as his Wikipedia page explains, sees his life as a series of experiments in which he immerses himself in a project or a lifestyle for better or for worse, and then he writes about what he's learned. We talked about his book Before the Puzzler when he was a guest on this show back in 2019. He had written a book called Thanks 1,000, in which he wanted to thank, and he embarked on a quest to thank every person who had a hand in making his morning cup of coffee a possibility, from the barista to the roaster, to the truck driver, to the warehouse operators, to the grower. Of course, it's a fascinating and a fun book that helps us to live with more gratitude. The Puzzler helps us to live with more curiosity, more flexibility. I love this book. It's full of riddles. It's full of questions. It's full of puzzles, new ways of looking at things in our life that can help us to not be so frustrated by them, but as he describes, as AJ talks about in this interview, to become more curious and less furious. AJ has given 4 TED Talks that have been viewed more than 10 million times. He contributes to the New York Times. He's a commentator for NPR. He's also an editor-at-large at Esquire magazine and a columnist for Mental Floss. You can learn more about AJ at ajjacobs.com. You can learn about this book at thepuzzlerbook.com, and you can find AJ on Twitter at ajjacobs. Okay, with that, I hope you enjoy and benefit from and find new, more exciting and empowering ways of looking at the world because of AJ's wisdom. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with my friend, AJ Jacobs. AJ, welcome back to the School for Good Living.
I am so pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. Brilliant.
Yes, it's truly my pleasure. Because you've been a guest on the show before, and I have asked you what's life about before, I want to start this conversation with a different question, which is, what are puzzles about?
Well, to me, I'm a puzzle obsessive. I am very pro puzzle, and I always have been. And to me, they're about the best parts of being human, which is ingenuity, creativity, curiosity, all that good stuff. And I know there are people who say that they are puzzle hesitant or puzzle phobic, but I truly believe there is a puzzle type for anyone. And I believe that life is a series of puzzles. So it actually ties back to your original question about what is life. Life to me is a series of puzzles, and all of my books are about the puzzle. So the puzzle of how do we be grateful? I wrote a book about gratitude. Puzzle of what is the importance of religion, if any? That was another puzzle that I tried to figure out. So I am a big fan.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And I'm reminded of something I once heard Timothy Leary say, that the universe is an intelligence test.
Oh, I love that.
Where he might have said the universe is a puzzle, Right.
Well, I do love, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
But Quincy Jones, the great musician, has a quote that I love where he says, "I don't have problems, I have puzzles," which I think is a great way to look at life, because problems it sort of brings up the idea of they're intractable, they're horrible. But puzzles are like, all right, let's roll up our sleeves and see if we can solve this, and maybe even have a little fun and play while doing it.
Yeah, I really like that. And you've written a book, The Puzzler, One Man's Quest to Solve the Most Baffling Puzzles Ever, from crosswords to jigsaws to the meaning of life. And in this book, which I love so much, we were talking before we were recording, I was sharing about how I was sharing this with my mom last night, the puzzles and riddles and some of the questions that you invite. But you make a very bold claim early on that I happened to agree with, but the skeptic in me was like, wait a minute. And here's what you write. You say, I have come to a conclusion that may seem overly bold, but I'm going to try to convince you of it by the time you finish this book. The conclusion is that puzzles can save the world, or at least help save the world. What do you mean by that?
Well, I truly do. And perhaps it's a little bit of a rationalization for having spent thousands of hours doing puzzles over my life, because I love all kinds. I love crosswords and Sudoku and jigsaws, you name it. I believe that what we just mentioned, this idea of curiosity, is the only thing that can save the human species, and that we have to look at the world through the lens of curiosity. And that's the way we're going to solve the big problem, not just like little personal problems, which I think is also key, like, who should sit next to whom at a dinner party, but also the big problems like poverty and the culture wars and the environment. And the way one example I give is I have really tried to change the way I approach conversations with someone who disagrees with me on politics or whatever. So say I'm having a conversation. The way I used to do it was almost as a war, a debate, a war of words. I'm going to berate them and I'm going to convince them to come to my side.
You're going to win.
What?
You're going to win. There's going to be a winner.
I was going to win. Yeah, it was a zero sum. And that rarely worked. I don't think it ever worked. I think it just polarized both of us. I got angrier and that other person got angrier. So instead, I've tried to reframe conversations like that as a puzzle. So the puzzle is, why do I believe what I believe? Why does she believe what she believes? What evidence is there for each of what evidence could change my mind if it was presented to me? What do we have that is common ground, and where do we go from here? All of these are fascinating puzzles, and it turns it into more of a cooperative adventure as opposed to a stressful battle of words. And that, I find, it's not only made my life better because I'm not angry and yelling when I talk to people who I disagree with. I think it's more productive. I've been able to, find these interesting common ground and ideas. And so that is the kind of attitude. When I say puzzles can save the world, that's kind of what I'm talking about. And just one addendum, which is, in some cases, literal puzzles have helped save the world. And I'm thinking of in 1942, the London Telegraph newspaper ran a crossword puzzle, very hard crossword puzzle. And they said, if you can solve this in 12 minutes or less, please get in touch with this number. And that number turned out to be the code-breaking arm of the British intelligence, Bletchley Park, you might have heard of, where they broke, Alan Turing and his co-workers broke the Nazi Enigma code. So you could argue that in that case, puzzles literally saved the world.
Wow. There's so much in what you just said, that thing about like getting curious and making space for another person's belief or their perspective and so forth. What's that saying about a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still? that idea.
I love that. I hadn't heard that. Yeah. And I also love, because it goes along with rhyming wisdom, which I think is a fun little subgenre. I heard one yesterday from a friend. Compare leads to despair. Compare and despair, which is like, if you're always comparing, that person has more money, that person has a better life, their house is more beautiful. That is not the road to happiness. Quite the opposite.
Yeah, no doubt. And that idea of making space for someone else's beliefs and worldview and getting curious about it, I see so much value in that in my role as a coach, because if we don't do that with others, we're very unlikely to do that with ourselves. And as I think we all know, what's the famous saying? Derek, who's the guy that did CD Baby, Tim Ferriss is interviewed, who talks about if more like flogging ourselves, if beating ourselves up was the answer to anything, we'd all already have 6-pack abs and be billionaires. Right? But it's that same mindset where we don't allow others, and we don't get curious about why we do what we do, or even why we think what we think, that we do cause a lot of unhappiness. And I really love what you're saying. And even the idea of this, a little bit philosophical, but anyone who knows me, that's no surprise. I have a teacher who once described love as making space for others to be all the ways they are and all the ways they are not. And if we don't have that curiosity or that willingness, our love is probably not likely to be very deep. So
yeah, that's wonderful. I love what you say. And I totally agree. You have to be curious with your own beliefs. And that's another huge virtue that I talk about in The Puzzler, because to solve little puzzles like crosswords and riddles, you have to have a flexible mind. Cognitive flexibility is so huge, and you can't fall in love with your hypothesis. So on the smaller level, it's like, I remember there was a crossword I once did where the clue was, this is the result of a bad trip. And it was a 9-letter word starting with F. And I was like, all right, I know, with LSD trip, it's flashback. And I was so convinced I was right. But the answer was not flashback. The answer was faceplant, because it's a different kind of trip.
Yeah.
But I was so locked in that I wasted an hour of my life because nothing was working. And I think that that's a good metaphor for the way we should look at any belief in our life. We shouldn't have total skepticism. We should, I think, science and experts play a huge role, but we should be flexible. We shouldn't, just because we believe something once, doesn't mean we always have to believe it. It's okay to change your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even have a term in the book I love that you gave me and other readers about the way of the eraser, to embrace the way of the eraser.
Thank you. I'm glad you like that. Or the delete key. I do work more on the computer but I am a huge fan of the eraser, because there are some people who say, oh, I do Sudoku or crosswords in pen, and that's what real men do. And I just think that's so diluted, because it's all about flexibility and being able to change your mind and probabilistic thinking. I am a huge fan of that. So, very few things, some things are, but very few things are on off. Yeah. Most of life is on a dimmer. So just, in terms of whether it's predicting the future, just saying, I think it's highly likely this will happen, or there's a 70% chance this will happen. Even in my own private life, I might take it too far, because my wife will say, what time are you going to be home? Well, there's a 60% chance I'll be home at 5. There's a 30% chance I'll be home at 6. But I just think it's a very good way to start thinking. We all have to start thinking less black and white and more probabilistically.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Well, and I think this is probably part of a larger way of thinking, way of being, that you call the puzzle mindset. To adopt a puzzle mindset. And there's also then, of course, puzzle solving strategies and some of these things that can become more tactical. And maybe we've covered it pretty well already, but when you talk about the puzzle mindset, what do you mean? Is there anything you would add to what we've already discussed?
Well, it's a lot about that idea of being curious, of being flexible. I actually, speaking of rhyming wisdom, I love this phrase that I got from a child psychologist, but I believe it applies not just to parenting, but every aspect, which is don't get furious, get curious. And that is the puzzle mindset. So whether it's, literal puzzles or little personal puzzles about your marriage or work, or the big societal puzzles, that mindset, I think, of deep curiosity and willingness to change and creativity, ingenuity, all these are part of the puzzler mindset.
Yeah. there's a French thinker I once read who said, to understand all is to forgive all. And that idea that if we're willing to go beyond what we see or what we think we see and ask questions or consider from another point of view, maybe we'd be a little more forgiving.
That's a fascinating point. And I do think forgiveness is a hugely underrated value in today. Like, I think I've seen in my lifetime a big dip in forgiveness. And I think it's a problem. And a friend of mine who's an Episcopalian minister, Lutheran, sorry. You might want to have her on at some point. Nadia Boltz-Weber. Have you ever heard of her?
No.
She's fantastic. She's like a highly tattooed Lutheran. I think she's a bishop now. But anyway, she's writing a book about forgiveness and how important it is, because seems like an unforgiving society we're in now. And I think someone told me a great quote by Nelson Mandela, which is, I hope I won't butcher it, but something like, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping that it hurts your enemies, which I think is so true. Like, forgiveness is not just good for the other person, it's good for you. Like, you will be happier if you're more forgiving.
Yeah, I certainly think so. And I once heard Gandhi had said, we won't be punished for our unforgiveness, we'll be punished by it. And I think,
right.
You know exactly what you're saying there. But this book, I love, and I realize, that, and maybe it's not exactly an example of apophenia, but I'd love if you'll talk about that as a phenomenon. But what I was going to say before that is about how, in your book, it's a book of puzzles. It's a book of questions and riddles and problems and things like that. And maybe that's all it is. But as we're discussing, I love that there really are life lessons or ways of being that we can look at. And one I want to talk about is also humility. So I'm just going to plant that seed and we'll come back to it. But will you also talk about this term? Again, you introduced me to apophenia. What is it? How can puzzles help us see it? And why might we be wise to be wary of it in our own lives?
Well, this I learned during research from a friend of mine who's a psychologist, and it is a hugely important concept that's become even more important recently with social media. And the apophenia is the phenomenon of seeing a pattern where none exists. And for instance, people who see the Virgin Mary's face in a piece of French toast, that is an example of apophenia. I mean, maybe it's there. I'm just a little.
I've got a kernel of popcorn, by the way, that we put in our little curio cabinet. I'm telling you, it looks exactly like a teddy bear. It's so funny. It's not a religious figure, but it's a teddy bear.
Is it an omen? Are you going to join a religion of teddy bears?
Maybe we need to buy more Beanie Babies or something. I'm not sure.
So pattern finding is a double-edged sword, because as humans, we are wired to find patterns. And that's very important. That's how we knew to be scared of snakes. That's how science works, by finding patterns. So patterns, yes, if they are real, are huge. But the problem is we are too programmed to find patterns. So we find patterns where none exist, like the French toast example. And I think we've seen a rise in apophenia. A lot of conspiracies, there are real conspiracies out there, but a lot of them are apophenia. People putting together dots that don't go together, putting together puzzle pieces that don't fit. So I really believe QAnon, for instance, is one of the darkest examples of apophenia. They've found all of these little random data points, and they are convinced that this proves that Tom Hanks is a cannibal pedophile, or whatever they believe. And no amount of evidence will dissuade them. So apophenia, as I say, the best weapon against it is to keep this flexible, open mind, and to be open to evidence that disproves your belief. And that, to me, Daniel Kahneman, the great Nobel-winning economist, talks about how he loves to be proven wrong, because it's the only way that he knows that he's in pursuit of the truth. So that kind of mindset, to me, is the way we battle apophenia.
Yeah. And I know it can be uncomfortable to for us as human beings to say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something powerful about certainty. I once heard Tony Robbins say that the greatest human need in the world is certainty. Like overall, I was like, that's amazing in all its various forms, whether that's from thinking we have financial security or job security, or this person will never leave me or whatever, that we're constantly seeking security. And I can see that. And yet it's amazing that there are people who will say, this is actually my greatest joy, to be proven wrong. And when we remember, like, and this is a little bit uncomfortable for me, but there's something also liberating and exciting about it, that like the scientific method, that thing like truths can never, at least as I understand it, right? Truths can never be proven. They can only be disproven.
Right.
It's pretty amazing, actually.
No, I mean, it is an acquired taste, this uncertainty, but I do think the world would be better if more people were able to sort of live in it. And you talk a lot about, in your writings and podcasts, about sort of, this mindfulness. And I think that this is part of mindfulness, being okay with uncertainty. And just to throw in one other great uncertainty quote, and again, I'm going to butcher the exact quote, but it was the philosopher Bertrand Russell who said, the whole problem with the world is that the idiots are so sure of themselves and all the smart people are so filled with doubt. Yes. And that really is that. I mean, that sums up a large part of our problem.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, talking about, the puzzle mindset and some of the qualities that we can cultivate that can help us to live more enjoyably and our relationships to work probably better than they otherwise would and things like that. The one that I mentioned just a moment ago, humility, that you talk about. You even, I thought it was really interesting that you describe it, at least in one place in your book, epistemic humility.
I love that phrase.
That right?
I mean, it's a little pretentious. And I actually used it like 8 times in my book. And my friend was like, you got to cut it down to like 3 or 4 mentions because it is just a pretentious phrase. But it's also, I think, a very important phrase. And it just means it's, sort of a fancy way of just saying that we should be humble about what we know. And just what we were talking about before, that we could be proven wrong, that we aren't certain of anything, but we should keep being curious and trying to find the truth. So to me, that is the key. And I think that, the problem is social media does not reward epistemic humility. Cable TV news does not reward epistemic humility. You get ratings for saying, the America is on the verge of collapse, and I'm 100% certain if we don't do X, then it will, it'll be the end of the world. That gets rewarded because that's, as you say, we're kind of addicted to certainty.
Yeah.
So it's developing this taste for humility and uncertainty. But I just wanted to, I'm a fan of gratitude. So I just wanted to thank you because I loved this is my second appearance, as you mentioned. And our first one, you gave me a great riddle, and I have a chapter on riddles. And I believe I had your riddle in one of the drafts, and it was cut just for space, but I still think of it often. So thank you. And if I say it, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but if you want to say it or include it in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even remember where I heard that riddle, but it's one that I've enjoyed. And I imagine it's medieval, probably somewhere in the mid ages. This is what is greater than God, but worse than the devil. Poor men have it, rich men need it, dead men eat it, but if you eat it, you will die.
It's good. I mean, I happen to know the answer because you told me, and I sort of got it with some hints from you, but the answer is
nothing.
Yep. Nothing. If you eat nothing, you will die. And yes.
And one of the strategies that you talk about in your book of solving problems or puzzles about breaking things down. Right? Because my experience is I relate that to people. And I think there's those 6 lines. There's kind of 2 pairs. Most people will ask all these big questions. They'll say these big things, time and space and, like this. But if you just put the last thing, what is greater than God? It's interesting how chunking it down, many people will go, oh, well, nothing,
Right. Oh yeah. That is a huge a huge strategy that I use in puzzles and in life. You got to break. Even writing this book was breaking down into chunks, because if I tried to conceive it of as one monolithic work, then it's just so overwhelming. And instead, just to break it down into chunks, I'm going to have a chapter on jigsaws, a chapter on rebuses, a chapter on mazes, and then it becomes manageable.
Yeah. In fact, I think I'll probably transition us. I do want to ask you about this really elegant thing that I've thought. I don't have any tattoos, but if I got a tattoo, I might get this as something the late Japanese puzzle maker Maki Kaji expressed to you in a beautiful and poetic way. Will you talk about what he shared with you?
I love this. I went to a lecture by him, and he's called, he died a few months ago, sadly, but he was called the godfather of Sudoku. He didn't invent Sudoku, but he brought it to a wide audience, and he's a puzzle maker in Japan. And he summed up all puzzles with three symbols, just three characters: the question mark, the arrow, an arrow pointing forward, and then the exclamation point. And he explained the question mark is when you see something and you're baffled. The arrow is the creativity phase where you're coming up with solutions, you're struggling, you're trying things out. And then the exclamation point is that aha moment that we all want. So I loved that. But then I loved it even more because he added some extra wisdom, which is that the key to puzzles, and not just puzzles, the key to life is embracing the arrow. That you may never get to that exclamation point in life or in the puzzle. So you have to enjoy the arrow. It's sort of, to me, a more poetic way of saying enjoy the journey, or you know, enjoy the climb up the mountain. You may never make it to the summit. But I thought it was beautiful. So I do try to enjoy the arrow, knowing we don't always make it to the exclamation point.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of spiritual truth in this where, you know, first I think of Gandhi, another saying I once read attributed to him. He said, allegedly, full effort is full victory.
That's
right?
nice. So, yeah.
And then coaches, I don't know if it was John Wooden or another coach who will say the score takes care of itself.
Oh, right? That's a good one too.
And so this idea that many spiritual teachers have talked about, working while renouncing the fruits of our labor, that, you know, the morrow, take no thought for the things of the morrow, for the morrow will take care of itself, kind of thing. And then engaging in, as cliche as it is, in the journey, in the process.
Right.
I think in that little three symbol thing, there's so much beauty and I think truth and wisdom to be found. Agree.
I was a huge fan, and I love your idea of the tattoo. I agree. I don't have any, but if I did,
that might be it.
If you do it, I'll do it. Actually, I take that back because my wife hates tattoos. I don't mind them, but my wife hates them.
Well, it is. That's another true. I think happy wife, happy life.
And it rhymes.
Yes,
excellent.
Yes, yeah. Rhyming wisdom. Well, let me just ask. I have two more questions about the puzzler, and maybe a few more will pop up. But one question is, Well, I'll take them in order. The first one is, how do you think? Or how do you, like, if you know, how might your life be different because you wrote this book, because you invested so much time in this? How do you think it might be different, or how is your life already different because you wrote this book?
Well, I'm going to break it down into chunks because we talked about that. So one, I do believe it's made me happier. Gratitude, as I say, gratitude and curiosity are my two favorite drives, emotions. So it really helped with my curiosity. It helped with my outlook of being less angry and more curious. So I think psychologically it was good. Number two, the book is a combination of history of puzzles and puzzles themselves. There are dozens of puzzles for you to fill out, but it's also my adventures immersing myself in these wonderfully eccentric puzzle communities. So the jigsaw fanatics, I went to Spain and I competed in the World Jigsaw Puzzle Championship with my family as Team USA. And it was a disaster. in one sense, because we came in second to last. I mean, we were not meant to be there. These people practice hours every day. But it was also wonderful because I got to meet this lovely community. And it was almost like the United Nations. It was all countries from all over the world, and they had this bond. So being able to, A, meet all these wonderful communities, and B, see the importance of community, which I think you've talked about many times. Having a community is just important to our happiness as humans. And 3, I think it actually made me a slightly better problem solver, maybe more than slightly, because I learned all of these tools of how to solve puzzles, but that can be applied to far more than puzzles. And one of them is one we talked about, and breaking down into chunks, or being super flexible, or looking at something upside down. All of these are important tools I've honed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me about something I think you suggest in the book, where either you said this or someone you interviewed talked about that perhaps part of the reason as humans we're so fascinated by puzzles is that they're kind of a practice for life.
Right.
And that they really can help us to live better, to survive better, and not just in picking up laundry, although that's one sometimes, or maintaining our car or whatever. But this idea also that you said recurred is a kind of a theme among puzzle fanatics of bringing order to chaos.
Yes.
Right? Will you say more about what you discovered about this? Because maybe it's our way of just bringing some organization to our little corner of the universe. But what was your experience or what did you discover about order and chaos in puzzles?
Right. Well, just to back up to the first part of what you said, that I think we are wired as humans, the scientists I talk about, we're wired to solve problems, and puzzles and problems are cousins. Because of course the first puzzle was, how do we find something to eat, or how do we find a mate? And it's not just humans. It's even slime molds can solve puzzles. If you put solve mazes. If you put food at the end of a maze, a slime mold will actually find its way. Wow. So it's cross species, across cultures, this desire to find. And I think that puzzles are almost the platonic ideal of a problem, because you have this one solution. In life, the solutions are never so neat. You'll have 5 different suboptimal solutions, and you have to figure out which one is best, which is a whole other puzzle. But in puzzles, if they're well constructed, you only have one. And it's that order out of chaos that I think is built into us. It's wired into us. And it's very, I think we live in a chaotic world, and it seems even more chaotic than it is because of social media. And so having this one little area that you can control is very satisfying. Yeah. And so I think that is a good mental benefit of puzzles. I also think, though, even there's a meditative benefit to some puzzles, like jigsaw puzzles. I know you like meditation, so like this idea of just, it doesn't take that much thought to do a jigsaw puzzle, but it can be so calming and relaxing.
Oh, absolutely. And I love what one of the people you talked to said about a jigsaw puzzle won't solve all your problems, but it's a problem you can solve.
Exactly. So that's the order out of chaos thing. Right.
Yeah. And then the other thing about the meditative, I didn't know this, so I was grateful to learn about labyrinths, and labyrinths can absolutely have this kind of quality. Will you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, this was fascinating because I wanted to do a chapter on mazes. So I went to the gathering of the Labyrinth Society, which is this a couple hundred people in Maryland who got together every year.
It's like something off The Office or something.
Well, it was fascinating, right, and unexpected, because I got there and I explained, I'm a writer, I'm doing a book on puzzles, and they said, well, you're in the wrong place, Buster. Labyrinths are not puzzles. In fact, they're the opposite of puzzles, because a puzzle is a maze, and a labyrinth, I learned, are totally different according to them. Mazes are you have a choice. Do I go right or left? And you get lost, and then you solve it. Labyrinths, no choice. It is just a spiral, and you walk in one way and walk out the other. There's no choice. And they said that is the beauty of labyrinths. It's a walking meditation, and there is no choice, and it's stress-free. And one guy told me, God created labyrinths to heal the trauma caused by mazes. So he's quite anti-maze. I liked mazes and labyrinths. So anyway, there's this movement of people, and it combines an interesting group. It's religious Christians. Some are sort of New Agers. Some are psychedelic fans. But they all love this walking meditation that is the labyrinth.
That idea that there's like one path. I mean, on the one hand, that's like, oh, that sounds dogmatic. But right. In another way, I love that, the idea that there's one true path for each of us to find and walk. There's something really cool about that. And I like,
I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say that I was surprised to learn that these weren't like labyrinths aren't necessarily all tall walls, right? Some of them you could just see low.
Right. Most of them are just rocks arranged or stones in a grass or even a tarp. And it's this, and they put them up in, near hospitals or rehab centers or churches. And it's a huge thing. And you can go on the internet and find the closest labyrinth to you. And I will say, I walked a few labyrinths as part of my research, and I liked them. They were meditative. I felt like, I had a nice glass of wine or something. But some people report that it's like scales falling from the eyes, like it is a mind-blowing experience. I didn't experience that personally, but I do. Going back to what you said, I think there are two parts of life that are equally important. One is this freedom of choice, which is, I think, important to our happiness. But then we can get overwhelmed, and there is something to the freedom from choice, this paradox of choice, that we have too many choices. So the labyrinth is sort of addressing that part of our nature.
Yeah, that's great. So then the last question before I would gently transition us to an exploration of writing and creativity as it relates to the puzzler is, I know we've covered so much already about this, but what, if anything, haven't we talked about related to this book that you want to talk about or you think the listener might enjoy hearing?
I think one thing that I loved, and I did touch on it, but just that puzzles are a uniting force. And I think all shared activities are. It doesn't have to be puzzles, but the idea of doing something together is so important. Some people think puzzles, you sit in the corner alone and work on a crossword. But most of the puzzlers I met, it's all about working with people or even comparing and sort of being like, I did Wordle faster than you. And speaking of Wordle, I saw the inventor of Wordle. And for those who don't know, it's a newish game, a word game where you have to guess 5 letters and they tell you which letters are right and wrong. And it caught on like crazy. It was like an obsession. And now there are about 8,000 Wordle spinoffs. So Wordle for art, Wordle for movies, Loodle, which is naughty words. So I love, and I'm a fan of Wordle, but the guy who invented it told a wonderful story that almost seems like it's, made for a screenplay, which is that there was a gay man who had been ostracized by his family. They were not on speaking terms because the family was very conservative in that way. But they all love Wordle. So Wordle is sort of the bond that they've rebuilt their relationship on. And I think that is a wonderful thought. And we need more of these combined activities in our splintered society to reform these bonds.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I too love Wordle. I don't know how I missed it, but one day I missed a cycle, like one day of sleeping and waking, I just got busy or something. And I broke my streak. I was almost to triple digits.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah, I forget occasionally, I have to say. I'm more obsessive about another puzzle called the Spelling Bee. I don't know if you've ever played that.
I have. I haven't subscribed to the Times yet. So then they're like, subscribe to get to the genius mode or whatever. I'm like,
they are really, and it's a lot, $40 a year.
Yeah, it's worth it.
So what is your opening word on Wordle?
I don't use one consistently. I will do the thing where I will look around a room. And then if I see a 5-letter word, I'll use it. My wife has opening words, but I'm not consistent. And I've had some where I'll get on a word I spotted randomly. I've had 3 green.
No way. But listen, I respect that 100%. I think we should all be doing that more, experimenting with our first word. I'm a hypocrite because I have the same first word and I don't like it. I feel shameful because it's not even a good word. It's soar, S-O-A-R-E, which is a young hawk. And I got it because I read an article that an artificial intelligence analyzed thousands of words and decided this was the best Wordle word. But it doesn't feel good. I think you inspired me. I'm going to try to change my word every day.
Or try the approaches, right? Because I have gone through periods where I've used consistent words like for a while. And by the way, I know S is obviously very common. I don't like to use S right away because when I get the fewer letters left, the S will often help me if I have a 4-letter that I can make it 5. But my wife's word right now, she loves ghost. And then the other one that I've loved in the past is audio. Because then you get 3 of the 5 vowels.
Yes. That is nice.
But
and you probably have some audio equipment. You're a podcaster.
A little bit around.
You look around and say, oh, audio.
Yeah. Well, in the book, you talk about your love of spelling bee. And this is actually, I think, a great segue to the creativity part, because I understand you do the New York Times crossword puzzle every night before you go to bed, which I didn't know. So thank you for telling me this, that you can do it online. Of course you can do it online. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. I do prefer it just because you can erase it. I love the eraser, but the delete key is even easier than the eraser. Yeah.
The challenge for me of doing the crossword puzzle online would be the temptation to Google, which I know it's okay if that's your own rule for yourself.
Right.
But I understand you do Wordle and the Times crossword puzzle before bed, and that spelling bee will sometimes wake you up at like 3 or 4 in the morning.
Right. This is not healthy. Yeah.
So my question for you about creativity is, I think it's great to have routines, and it's great to do things that light us up and that we love, because that, I believe, that passion can overflow into our work.
Right.
But how do you not allow what could be considered distractions? Like, how do you walk the line of doing what you love without letting it get in the way of your work and your productivity?
Oh, that's a lovely thought. Well, I do try to be disciplined with, I'm going to, whether it's the 25 minutes, 5 minutes, what's that Pomodoro method. So I do try to have my little treats like the spelling bee in those 5 minutes. I will also say, I love what you say about the tension between routines and total creativity. And sometimes I think they can actually cross over. Like for instance, and I think I might have mentioned this on our first podcast, but I still every day, I have a list of things I do in the morning. And one of them is to spend 15 minutes just brainstorming ideas. And they could be article ideas or book ideas, but often they're just random. Like you, I'll look around the room and I'll say, outside I see a snowman, and what can I do creatively with that? How can I play with it? What if it was a snow person or a snow non-binary, or, so just like taking it and twisting it in all different directions. And 99.5% of these ideas will never see the light of day. But I love, as you know, my obsession with keeping the mind flexible and supple. And I think this is really good exercise for that. So that's a routine in one way that leads to freedom and lack of routine in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. You tell me about I understand that you were writing a different book before you wrote The Puzzler, that you got about 3 months into something. You obviously put a lot of work and a lot of thought into, and yet you were willing to, I don't know that you abandoned it. That might be too strong a word, but you ceased work on that.
Right.
Can you talk about what it was like to choose a project, begin, and then for whatever reason, choose a different project kind of mid-flight?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the lessons of the puzzler is, as I say, pivoting is important, and not being attached. So the book I got a contract to write, and I spent 3 months on it, as you say. It's actually, I think, a very interesting topic, and I still am interested in it. It was all about this epistemology, this how do we know what we know? And especially in this alleged post-truth world and fake news and social media, how do I know the most basic thing? How do I know the world is round, not flat? How do I know that my wife loves me? She says she does, but I'm not 100%. I'm not in her mind. How do I know that the New York Times is more reliable than Fox News or Newsmax? And so I was going to dive in and try to find out, how do we find the truth? And I spent 3 months on it, and it was fascinating, but it was also extremely stressful. I felt overwhelmed. I wasn't sure the book would help the problem of post-truth, because I was worried people might read it and be like, oh yeah, it's just a mess. I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to believe whatever I believe, which is not helpful. So I was miserable, and my agent, so I'm very grateful to him. He said, well, why don't you, instead of being miserable, try to do a book about something you love? He knew I love puzzles. And I said, okay, well, let me think about that. And luckily, not only did I love them, but I do think that they're important. And I begged my editor, and she's like, actually, yeah, I might like this better. So it was stressful before I got it approved. And it's a little stressful that I wasted, scare quotes around that, wasted 3 months. But I don't see it as a total waste. I learned a lot. And as you say, I may still go back to it in some form, just not that exact form.
Wow. I hadn't realized that you actually had a contract for that book.
Oh, yeah. No, it was called Fact Checking My Life. And I still want to do something with it. It's just because it is a super important topic. And we mentioned it earlier a lot, but I don't know. I haven't. For me, structure is everything. Structure is so crucial. Once I have a structure for a book, so my book that we talked about last time was Gratitude, and the structure was thank 1,000 people. And I was even able to structure it more by like grouping 1,000 people who helped make my cup of coffee. And here's a chapter on the transportation it requires to get coffee to, the truck that drives the beans and the boat. So there's a whole chapter on transportation. And I was able to break it down into very manageable chunks. And this book on fact checking my life, I just couldn't get the structure correct.
I just hearing the premise, if I imagine myself as having the assignment to write that book, I can feel, like, literally in my body, I can feel the anxiety, like the tension and the discomfort. And exactly. I remember Tony Robbins, when you go back to him, that he suggested one time in a seminar I attended that if we question anything, we can erode our belief in it. Like literally anything. And conversely, we can generate certainty at will. Right. Kind of like what we were saying, that quote from Bertrand Russell, which is amazing, that I believe it is possible for us to say, I believe this, even in the absence of evidence, in the absence of agreement, I choose to believe. Right. And I think it's terrifying to realize that we have that freedom and ability.
Yes, it is. Well, both sides are very scary and dangerous, I think, because if you're a radically skeptic and say, no one knows anything, I'm not going to listen to scientists or doctors because what do they know? Then I think that's a disaster for society. But on the other hand, if you never question anything and believe anything someone, a cable pundit says, that's also terrible. So it's this very tricky middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet beautiful, I think that if you say, and I believe this as a coach, that you have all of your own answers inside you, that the truth, your truth is available to you in every moment. But then the question is, can you hear it? And how do you have to live so that you can? And then do you have the courage to follow it? And what would that mean? And so forth. But I'm a little afield. Let me come back to the book and your creative process, because you talk about structure as being important in your own work and life. But when it came to the puzzler, how did you chunk out? Like, did you sit in a room alone for a while with sticky notes, or did you, just have one of these brainstorming sessions one time? Like, how did you come up with the structure? How did you have enough certainty on what your structure was to proceed with the research and the writing versus, because I know this can be a kind of a trap for us as creatives, is that it's like, well, it's not baked enough to go actually do the research or do the drafting. Right. How did you firm it up enough for yourself to go do the work that became the finished book?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the answer is it evolved, and I had to keep an open mind and say, this structure is constantly changing, which it did. And, I had a chapter on tangrams, this great Chinese puzzle, but it ended up not making the book. And I think a lot of it, since we as humans love stories, a lot of it was related to what kind of puzzles can I find people with the best stories, like these amazing, like say I found one woman obsessed with this puzzle at the CIA, and she moved across the country to be closer to it. Like, that's a good story, because people need color. They need human drama and conflict and joy. So that played into it, and it was fluctuating right to the end.
Wow. Talking about storytelling, will you say a little about this? I realize this might be kind of granular for some people who really are interested in writing. I think they might value this. So, and I'm personally curious, but when it comes to storytelling, right, there's the old adage of show, don't tell, right? But as people who are trying to recapture and convey other people's experiences, we acknowledge we weren't there. So it's not up to us to be literary about the sky was this color and, the wind was doing this. So we're not trying necessarily in a literary way to recreate and share the experience. But where I'm trying to go with this is, how do you, as one who's weaving stories into your work, go beyond merely telling a story and do your best to give it dimension, give it depth, give it interest, and not just say, well, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And maybe that's enough times, but how do you actually make it come alive?
I guess that there are two almost opposing methods I use. One is to go very, very granular, small, and one is to go very big. So if I'm interviewing someone who, say they were struck by lightning, and they say, yeah, I was eating lunch, I would in my interview, I'd say, what were you having? Oh, a sandwich. What kind of sandwich? Oh, a ham and cheese. Was it on rye? So then I get all of these nice details, which are good for the reader. So you've got all these details. But then it can't just be a list of details. It has to have the bigger meaning, which is, how did they feel? What were they thinking? So then I'll step back and say, okay, so how did it feel? What did it feel like? Give me a metaphor. Like, did it feel like, you got 100 cases of COVID at the same time? Did it feel like you were, crushed by a falling dumpster? Give me a good metaphor. So it's a combination of very specific details and big thoughts, often and feelings, often expressed with a metaphor.
Right on. And then how do you know? I mean, maybe this is kind of intuitive as you get into the writing, but as you mapping out the outline and the structure of chapters and things like that, how do you know where to put the stories in? Do you try to use them as interest grabbers at the opening of chapters, or to prove a point or something? How do you use a story once you've identified it as something you want to include?
I love that. Well, one of the methods of solving puzzles that I talk about is start with the easiest part. So when you see a crossword puzzle and you have no idea what to do, find that one clue that you actually, and then build out from there. So if I have a great story, like, say I have a great story about Rubik's Cubes, this woman who, like, Rubik's Cube saved her life because she had, her hands were paralyzed and she was able to use the Rubik's Cube to, another one that's like a movie, to cure her illness. But so I have that, and I'm like, okay, I'm starting with that. I know that's going to be in there. Now, where do I build it? How do I intro it? How do I outro it? Where does it fit in? Here are 5 ideas I want to cover. I know that this Rubik's Cube is really compelling and maybe the most compelling part. And it may end up that it's the opening because it grabs people, but it may end up that I open and then lead into it. And I don't think there's one right answer. I think I try to remind myself, there's no one perfect way to write this chapter. There's, it all depends on dozens of factors, and one person could love it this way, another person could love it that way. So I don't see it as like a life and death decision that this has to be here and that has to be there. But starting with what I know I shouldn't say for sure because we've been talking about but what I know I really do want to include, and then building out from there.
With these stories that you include, how much do you involve the subject of the story after the fact? Do you provide them a little draft and say, hey, did I capture this right? Do you ask them for a release, like a legal release? How do you just do the interview and write it and then publish it? Like, how does that all unfold usually?
Well, I know a lot of nonfiction writers have different strategies. If I were writing like an expose of the White House, of course, I wouldn't send it to them. But I'm writing a book about the joy of puzzles, and I want to relay the truth. And so I do send them. I interview them, I write it up, and then I say, here's what I wrote. Does this look accurate to you? And weirdly, more often than not, they improve so it's not a negative. They'll actually say, well, actually, I don't have that book on my desk. I have this book. And the book they provide is funnier and weirder than the one that I had spotted. So often it improves it. Not always. Sometimes they'll say, please don't say that. It'll get me in trouble with my boss. And I'm not out to get anyone fired. So I am of the type who actually sends it to them. But again, like if I were doing hard journalism, that is very frowned upon.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then talking about, just a moment ago, you said something that reminded me, I think we talked about this last time too, about your process as you near the having some kind of a finished draft, some kind of a draft to share, that you do have a group of readers that you will invite to read, to comment, to talk about if anything wasn't clear or what they like or what they don't like. And I think you even use a spreadsheet to track this, or you have in the past.
I haven't. For this one, yes, I find reader feedback incredibly helpful, and actually is one of the downsides of being a writer, and why I'm jealous of you, because when you're interviewing people, you can kind of get immediate feedback on whether the question sparks something exciting or just makes their eyes glaze over. But I don't get any feedback for a month, so I have to go out of my way I'll write a few chapters and I'll select 10 or 15 people I trust, and I send it to them. But I make very specific requests, because if I just said, do you like this? They're my friends. They're going to say they liked it, even if they didn't. So I ask them, which are the 5 chapters you found most interesting, and which are the 5 you found least interesting? And then I can use that data, because if, 12 of them say, well, this chapter is kind of slow, I know that's not a fluke. That is something to work on. Now, I will say it's worked better in the past for this book on puzzles, since it consists of 20 different chapters of 20 kinds of puzzles. People just like the kind of puzzle that they like. So if, the crossword lovers were like, oh, I love the crossword chapter. The Sudoku lovers were like, oh, the Sudoku was my favorite. So it ended up not being all that helpful this time. But in years past, it has been invaluable.
Yeah. It reminds me, I once heard Jack Canfield talk about his process of collecting and sharing stories. And when he wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul, that he did this with a group of kind of beta readers, you might call it. And he said that he knew that most readers don't finish a book before they talk about it to their friends, right? They'll talk about it as soon as they start reading it. And so he very deliberately front end loaded Chicken Soup for the Soul with the most moving, or the stories that his beta readers said, these were the best.
Yeah.
And so people would get into it and immediately tell their friends, oh, you've got to buy this book. It's so good. That's smart.
That's wise. That's some wisdom from Jack Canfield. Absolutely.
Yeah. Tell me, if you will, about the difference between okay, actually, let me pause that, because I'm super curious about, you've actually not just written a book about puzzles, you've actually made a puzzle. I feel like I did with this earlier, and it's got a cash prize, 10 grand, right?
Yes. I'm afraid by the time this airs, it probably won't be available. But it's still a great story, and you can still solve the puzzles, even if you don't get the cash prize, because the finals begin, and you can cut this out if you want. The finals begin Saturday, June 4th, and they're probably going to be over soon. But yes, this I was very excited about, because as a kid, I read this book called Masquerade, and it was a British book by this artist with these weird, beautiful illustrations of people dressed up in rabbit suits and having, dancing with the moon. And those illustrations contain hints to an actual buried treasure somewhere in England, a golden rabbit sculpture. And people went nuts. It caused a craze, a mania. Like, people were digging up yards and, trespassing all over England. But I remembered it. And so I thought, when I wrote a book about puzzles, I want to do that. I don't want to have people dig up their neighbor's yard, because I don't want to be sued. But I like the idea of hiding a secret puzzle in the book. So the introduction to the book actually contains a secret puzzle, which leads to a code word. And the introduction is available on the puzzlerbook.com website, thepuzzlerbook.com, for free. So you don't have to buy the book. I hope you will, because I think it's fun, but you don't have to. And if you find the passcode, that's where the real craziness starts, because you put the passcode into the website and it opens up to a suite of about 30 puzzles that are I didn't write them. These people, who are some of the best puzzle makers in the world, wrote these puzzles, and they are bizarre and delightful and challenging and weird. And, they are like, you think it's a crossword puzzle, but then it turns out to be some other kind of puzzle. So I highly recommend people try, and do it with friends, though. Because, like I was saying, it's a communal thing. And these puzzles are sometimes so challenging, it really helps to have different points of view.
That's such a fun concept. Once the finals are over, will you publish the code so people can just go do the 30 puzzles? Yes,
exactly. So everything will remain open. You won't be able to win the $10,000, but you can do all the puzzles. And yes, if you go to thepuzzlerbook.com, it will give you hints to the code. If you really want to, you can just say, just give me the code. And then you can put that in, and it'll open up to the puzzles.
All right. That's fun. Will you tell me about the difference between the audiobook and the printed book? And I love that you read the audiobook as well.
Oh, yes, I did.
Yeah, not everyone reads his or her own books, but you do. And then you changed the way that you do kind of the end content of each chapter.
Right. The book contains tons of puzzles, both old and new, like the oldest crossword puzzle. But a lot of those puzzles are visual, and it's very hard to reproduce. We do provide a PDF that you can download when you buy the audio puzzle, but I felt bad for the audio listeners that they aren't getting this experience of solving puzzles in the middle of reading the book. So I spent and I didn't get paid for this, so it might have been a waste of my time, but I hope not. I spent a long time coming up, collecting, curating, and creating audio puzzles. So a lot, riddles are very good audio puzzles, but there are also ones sort of like name that noise type of puzzles. And I have gotten nice feedback, although I did do one riddle that I've gotten probably 10 emails saying there's an alternate answer. Do you want to hear it? You might have heard this riddle.
What is it?
It is a bear goes 1 mile south, 1 mile east, and 1 mile north, and comes back to the same place. What color is the bear?
So I do remember that from that there's only one place on Earth that you can follow those instructions. So the bear must be white. It must be a polar bear. However,
exactly.
There's apparently an alternate answer. What's the alternate answer?
Well, the alternate answer is, it was, the real answer is the North Pole, because
the North Pole. Yeah.
Right. They go down and east and then north, and it's almost like an arc. That's the only place where you'll end up with the same. You don't even have to make a square. You make a triangle. Problem is, it also works at the South Pole. So I got like 10 puzzlers, like, it also works. And my well, actually, to their well, actually is, but the South Pole doesn't have polar bears. So there you go. It's probably not the South Pole unless you import the polar bears.
That's great. Okay, so I'm just looking at the creative questions I had. We talked about outlines. We talked about how you don't allow puzzles to get in the way of your productivity. Oh, this. In your acknowledgements, you mentioned that Karen and Chloe, do I have that right, Harris?
Oh, yeah.
That they read this out loud. Will you tell me why and what the benefit of that was?
Well, that's a good friend of mine. His name is Kieran Harris, and his wife, Chloe. He's actually a podcast producer for a podcast called 80,000 Hours, which is affiliated with Effective Altruism, which is all about how do we do good best, which is a fascinating movement, and I love it. And he's great, but he's also super supportive. So they would read the chapters out to each other and make note of when the other person laughed. And that's important data for me. And I will say they weren't the only ones who read it out loud. I read it out loud a couple of times to myself, because at least my style, I like to have it a bit conversational. Now, that's not the only writing style. I think, some people write beautifully and in long literate sentences that are not conversational. And so this might not work for them. But for me, I like to have my book be a conversation with the reader. So reading it out loud is hugely helpful. And I bet if I read it now, I would change like 1,000 things if I read it out loud. It's just, you've got to give it up at some point. There's no perfection. You just got to get it out there.
Yeah. What's that saying that books are never finished, only published?
Yeah, I love that saying. Exactly.
I'm with you. But when I heard the first guest I ever heard talk about reading a manuscript aloud was Donald Robertson, who wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Stoic Wisdom. And he said that he paid someone in his neighborhood to come over and read it. And of course, it took like 8 or 10 hours. But hearing it out loud can help you become aware of things or change the pacing or the rhythm and things. So I was interested when I read that you had people.
Well, first of all, though, that is fascinating to have someone else read it. I have never tried that, but you have inspired me. I'm all about experiments. So I'm going to see, maybe that's an even better way if it's someone else reading it out loud.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Another guest of mine, and I know this is a little different from hearing another human do it. And I think there's value in that, but something I've started doing because another guest of mine said that Microsoft Word actually has a feature where it will read aloud.
Wow.
So I actually use that every week when I write my newsletter to just see, and that helps me. You know how hard it is to edit your own stuff. That's the closest to like, boom, catching typos and
thank you.
Like
I'm going to try that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Love it.
Well, with that, we have covered, I feel confident This is an interview. I've been thinking and looking forward to this for a few weeks. So I've had my list of questions and you have answered them all. So I'm confident that I'll only have like one or two, the French call staircase wit, the thing you should have said on the way out. But I'm confident I'll only have one or two questions I'll wish I had asked when I'm on my way home.
Well, you know what? You don't have to wish. I will happily get back on and you can.
You're amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I will just end with the question that, as a coach, I'm actually not a fan of advice, but I don't have a word that I like better, at least in this application. So I'm just kind of voicing that. But what advice or what encouragement or what would you say to anybody listening who is either in the act of they're in the arrow of their own book,
right.
Or it's a dream they've had for a long time that for whatever reason they haven't really committed to. What do you say to people in that situation who are aspiring to get their own book done?
Interesting. Okay. Well, first of all, it's funny you bring up advice because I did tweet a couple of weeks ago saying, I'm going to write an advice column called here's some stuff that worked for me. It may or may not work for you. It hasn't been tested scientifically and probably never will, but maybe you'll find it good. Maybe it'll be counterproductive, but here you go. It's a little bit of a long
book subtitles.
Exactly. So I don't think that would be a successful advice column, but yes, what has worked for me is to embrace, if you can't embrace, at least tolerate rejection and failure, because it is such a part. And I, as a starting writer, I was like, 99.5% of things would get rejected or not even rejected. They wouldn't even respond. And I'm still, the majority of stuff I pitch, I get rejected, even though I've been doing this for so long and I've had some level of success. It's just that there's only so many places and there's so many great ideas that it's hard. So just know that it's not personal. It's just that, there's a glut of stuff, and just keep on sending it out, being okay with rejection. And also, even if you don't feel it's finished, send it to some friends and get their feedback. Because that way it's almost, I feel, if I never did that, if I waited until it was done, as we say, it'll never happen. It'll never be done. So even just forcing myself to send, 80% written stuff with a lot of TKs is what we use in journalism, which means to come, which means I'm going to fill this in later, paragraph TK. I send that out to friends and say, sorry, it's not completely done, but am I in the right direction, or do you think I should switch? To me, that's very motivating.
Right on. Okay. Well, things that have worked for you that might or might not work for you, dear reader. That's awesome. All right. Well, again, my guest today, AJ Jacobs, his latest book, The Puzzler, One Man's Quest to Solve the Most Baffling Puzzles Ever, from crosswords to jigsaws to the meaning of life. AJ, it's been so fun. Thank you for making time to talk with me again.
Oh, my pleasure. Brilliant. I'll come on anytime you want. It was a delight.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the School for Good Living podcast. Before you take off, I just want to extend an invitation to you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life still isn't working for many people. Whether it's here in the developed world where we deal with depression, anxiety, loneliness, addiction, divorce, unfulfilling jobs or relationships that don't work, or in the developing world where so many people still don't have access to basic things like clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or they live in conflict zones, there are a lot of people on this planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, or even if your life is working, but you have the sense that it could work better, consider signing up for the School for Good Living's transformational coaching program. It's something I've designed to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated, or you've gone through a divorce, or you've gotten married, headed into retirement, starting a business, been married for a long time, whatever. No matter where you are in life, this 9-month program will give you the opportunity to go deep in every area of your life, to explore life's big questions, to create answers for yourself in a community of other growth-minded individuals. And it can help you get clarity and be accountable to realize more of your unrealized potential. It can also help you find and maintain motivation. In short, it's designed to help you live with greater health, happiness, and meaning so that you can be, do, have, and give more. Visit goodliving.com to learn more or to sign up today.